Hello there, this is the Heart of Witchcraft podcast, and this is Sassafras. It is September 6th, it is Labor Day weekend, it is Sunday. I work tomorrow, but I do hope that most of you are having a wonderful Labor Day weekend, and that you do not work tomorrow. It is perhaps the most beautiful day yet in the year, at least where I live, in the mid-Atlantic. I wish there was ever so slightly more of a breeze, but definitely a good day to spend outside. So, I hope things have gone well for everyone. It's been a little while since last we spoke. The topic of today is going to be on the subject of knowledge and wonder. And why is this important? Why is this a thing to talk about? Well, what on earth do I even mean? I think that an absolutely essential element in witchcraft and of doing magic in general is a sense of wonder. A sense of wonder would be the idea that there are things, entities, powers, potencies, there are things out there that we don't quite understand. There are things out there greater than us. There are things out there that really evoke this sense of mystery and this weird sensation, this excited curiosity. And I think that that is an essential element in your practice. I think that that is kind of one of the things which distinguishes Wicca from some other religions, although most religions do have mystery at its core. Well, I think that that kind of definitely comes into play. Kind of definitely. That's a way to put stuff. Anyway. So, what do I mean then by knowledge? Well, I've always said, and I've been quoted a few times in saying this, that the gods use what they find in the attic. What do I mean? When you have a dream and you have symbolism and you have symbols rolling around in your mind, I'm not saying that you won't receive guidance, you won't receive messages, you won't receive... All kinds of things can happen when you have an interesting and novel dream, and not necessarily all dreams, for example, are, from the gods, are messaging. Not all of them are. But sometimes you'll get you'll have a dream that just sticks with you. And we can completely divorce the gods from this. This is a human quality. You can imagine your mind expanding and growing and going in all of the places that it can't go during during those times of consciousness, and so the mind goes there. I think that this is an element and a route by which the divine communicates with humans. I think that even if you took this purely as a psychological exercise, there would still be value in it, and there would still be value in what I'm describing here. It's trickier because my viewpoint has shifted ever so slightly, and maybe I'll talk about that at some point. But in the end, I do think that almost all of this can be used and utilized by someone who doesn't necessarily have a direct connection to the divine, or doesn't necessarily have a direct relationship, doesn't necessarily have a comprehensive and ongoing dialogue, as it were. And I would be surprised to find people who do claim such things who don't, speak in glossolalia at a Pentecostal church because the angels told them to. But moving on, and I'm not meaning to make fun of that practice. That's a human thing, and we see that all over the place as well. It's ecstatic worship. Anyway, I would just say that that's a little bit outside of the realm of most folks who are listening to this podcast, perhaps. I digress. When you are first getting involved in this path, when you're first getting into things, you may find yourself overwhelmed with how much stuff you think you need to know, how many directions you need to expand and learn. You have so much learning to do. And this is true, but you know that you do, but you don't really know where to go, you don't know where to get that knowledge. And one of the curses of this current era is there's so much information out there, you have a lot of difficulty sifting through it and seeing what's actually useful, and so you can often feel stagnated, and while you need to learn a lot, you don't know how to start, you don't know where to start, and so you kind of, it bothers you. because you don't have a way to go. And it's not like you have some teacher telling you what to do in all cases. And so you're left to your own devices and you do your own thing. And this is kind of where we get... So there's a term called unverifiable personal gnosis, or unverified personal gnosis. What are those? Well, in a way, your dreams are this. These are things that you personally receive, that you personally experience, and they have an impact on your practice. They have an impact on what you do. They have an impact on what you believe. And conversely, when we get together, people speak about their experiences. And in a lot of ways, they share these things. And there's nothing wrong with sharing your UPG, as they call it, with other people. But you have to recognize, one must recognize, that ultimately your experiences are exactly your own. If you go bungee jumping and you have an exhilarating experience, it's a rush, it's amazing, you love it, you can't wait to do it again, that's great, that's good, it's awesome that happened. If someone else does bungee jumping, and nothing goes wrong, there's no incident here to record aside from their experience of doing the bungee jumping, and they're like, that's the most terrifying thing I ever did, I'm never doing that again. No thank you. Or scuba diving. You go scuba diving, you love scuba diving, you take classes, you do all this stuff, and it's awesome, it's amazing, it's exhilarating, and again, and actually that taps into the wonder, being in a foreign environment, being underwater. There's very little things as awe-inspiring as the ocean and as just bodies of water in general, because they're not a place that we humans can naturally occupy for long periods of time, although people adapt. You see the folks who are, the conch divers, or the people who dive for pearls, who literally do it with no equipment whatsoever. They're just they do it a lot, and as a result of doing a lot, you often see in these nature documentaries, you'll see some islanders doing it, but that's really no different than anyone who does it enough is going to be operating in a similar capacity. You learn that you don't need all of the extra gear, you don't need all this other stuff. I read this awesome and amazing book called Depth, and I really enjoyed this book. It's like a spiritual book, not exactly, but I found a lot for my spirit was nourished by this book. But basically it's about free diving. It's about diving into the water without gear and protections and anything like that, and actually going for depth, seeing how low and how far down you can go. And actually, although obviously you should be experienced, don't take my word for it, this is a podcast on witchcraft, don't go diving based on what you hear here, but this is something that I really want to explore, because I actually have a fear of deep water. But I like facing my fears. I would rather face my fears than not, in a logical and sane fashion, although you have to dispel a good bit of your rationality when you face your fear, which is one of the awesome things about it. I do think that there's something divine about horror itself, about the things that terrify us. But moving on. Well, anyway, so these free divers will just dive, and they'll go down and down and down, and they don't have scuba gear. They don't have anything. In fact, actually, our lungs operate better. I mean, you're not breathing underwater, but you are better able to withstand pressure. You don't need anything to protect you from pressure when you're free diving. You don't need that equipment, because your lungs are not being kind of artificially filled and forced to expand. No, instead they are able to adapt to the environment. It's been a long time. I think it's been about 6 years since I read that book. I need to try and find that thing, dig that thing out again. I read that when the middle child was born, 2013. Yeah. Anyway, I think that kind of experience. Now, of course, this person was writing about their own experiences. This person was writing about what they had experienced and what they had done. But did you think that wouldn't have an element on that person's imagination kind of from that moment forward? Your ability, it's kind of like reading fiction. And I always advise trying to read fiction. If I myself am not inclined toward fiction, I'm sitting here. Well, it depends on how cynical you want to get. Am I right? But I prefer to read nonfiction. I prefer to read things that are more applicable. I've read fantasy, and I do read fantasy. For example, I'm one of those crazies that the Game of Thrones television series didn't really exist. I'm still waiting for Winds of Winter. watched the show up into and including book 5, but I kind of just fell off after that. It wasn't interesting to me, and it appears that I was correct in that, because books and television are different mediums. I have no problem with someone adapting a series to another medium, but when you're adapting it and you are so dependent on it, it ends up looking a lot like that. Like, how often do you see someone who does what, the fans of the written word would consider to be a good job on that? I'm not meaning for this to be a pop culture episode, but for example, now, I mean, I'm a book fiend. I'm a book hound, and this goes into the knowledge thing. I read and read and read. I try to read at least 2 to 3 hours every day. I find that personally important, and I find it kind of a bit of a vocation. I notice when I haven't done it, and it kind of like psychically stings, and I mean that, very much tongue-in-cheek, because if I'm not doing that, I feel like it's not like a feeling like I'm falling off, because who am I really competing with other than me? It's kind of like if you have a friend who is... And I'm not trying to elevate reading to the level of a marathon running, but if you have a friend who's a marathon runner and you are not, as I am not, you're very impressed with all of their efforts in trying to do the Ironman, training for the Ironman and participating in the Ironman. I know a number of folks who have done this, and I'm always amazed. I'm amazed. These folks are amazing, and it takes discipline. And ultimately, I think that's really what is the element of, I feel like I need to be reading more and more because it's a mental discipline. This is a thing I've decided that I want to do, and I'm going to push myself to do it if I have to. And I think that there's an element of that which is necessary in witchcraft. If you're someone who likes to take a more relaxed path in your efforts, I'm not going to call you lazy, because I don't think that accurately captures it. I think that's got too much baggage, like cultural baggage. What is lazy? It gets into the Protestant work ethic here in the United States. But if you like to take the easy path, if you're a Taoist, I'm all for it. I like that. If you can justify it philosophically, I will give you a pass. But I think you need to put in work. You absolutely need to put in work on this. And what do I mean by work? I mean a lot of elements. Witchcraft is not therapy. Witchcraft is not there to, comfort you and reassure you. Witchcraft is there to affect change, and there's nothing blocking you from affecting personal change and improving change, and that's kind of a bit of the work, is to be better than when you started and to continue working. It's not a substitute for the various elements and practices that goes into, if you decide that I need to improve my physical discipline, I need to get it in better shape, I need to get in all of that. You can certainly do a spell, you can certainly do an operation to help you and assist you with that, but it's not going to work by itself. It's going to take... And you can approach this, in a full court press. And I always, for anything that you're doing for a magical operation, you must approach it from a full court press. If you are desperately, if you're desperate for love, I would actually argue you don't want it right now. But, you hear so many stories about people who, they want to find love, and it turns into this kind of obsessive thing, and the joke always comes is that, well, love shows up for them when they stop trying and they relax a little bit. But but if you want a relationship, if you want to develop a personal rapport with someone, and then you never talk to them, if you never approach them, you're never in their presence, and of course in COVID all of that is shot if it's someone that you don't already know and already have that with. And in fact, for a period of time when the state was more or less on lockdown, even going out and meeting someone for coffee would have been somewhat irresponsible. Perhaps, is that the right way to put it in a pandemic? I don't know. I mean, the area where I am has a very good grip on things, and had a very good grip on things almost from the beginning. We'll see where things go, and I want everyone to do everything they can to be safe during this era of COVID, but don't get neurotic about it. And I don't mean, don't get neurotic about it. I don't mean not to take precautions and to use that as a way to, get rid of those precautions. I work in healthcare. You should definitely take precautions, but if it starts to, you need to relax a little bit. Don't let it affect your mental health. do all that you can, but recognize that if you're doing all that you can, there are going to be limits to that, and you have to try and be kind to yourself in the process. Because it's one of those things. You read about the effect that this is having mentally on people. All right, I'm so distracted. But all of these things kind of blend in once you start to consider that your experiences are only going to ever be affected by what you know and what you've been exposed to, consciously or unconsciously. How often when you're reading, and fiction is a good example, how often when you're reading fiction, the way in which things are described in words, and I don't know, there are different brains, there are different people who analyze things differently, but I always, and of course there are limits of vocabulary. It's kind of neat. This is an aside, and it's a little personal, but I'm a fan of I like hip hop music. I like hip hop music, and I like death metal. So there's your, and I like classical, and I like opera. But anyway, I'm getting distracted. In hip hop, occasionally you'll see someone will put out a chart, which like roughly lists where the vocabularies of various artists are, and it's always neat to see where different artists kind of chart as to how complex their vocabularies are in their rhymes. Just one moment here. A wasp has landed on my desk. I need to do something about this. Give me just a moment. So I'm normally someone who roughly ascribes to ahimsa. I'm someone who roughly doesn't want to hurt anybody or anything. However, I'm also the father of the household. I'm up here in the attic where my wife studies. I'm not gonna let her get stung by a wasp because I chose to not remove the wasp. So the wasp is removed. So yes, excitement, adventure, always the heart of witchcraft. So I forget where I was just before my winged friend assisted, and trust me, so long ago I made a vow to the gods that I would raise bees. I would have beehives, and it is legal in my town to have beehives. I can have 2 beehives. How exciting! Well, I swore in the height of intoxication that I promised to the gods that I would I would have bees. I would have beehives. Not because I wanted their honey, not because I wanted to. I make mead. It's a very amateur process, but it's way better than anything I've ever had commercially. I occasionally will make a few gallons of mead. It takes about anywhere from like 6 to 9 months. Sacred alcohol making. There's our recipe. How to make mead in the most savage registered trademark of terms. I'll do an episode on that. Sure. Anyway, I promised I would have bees, not because I wanted to have their honey or not because I wanted anything from them. I just wanted there to be more bees around. In our region, it's a very agricultural area, and I really, really wish that we had more bees. I have some theories as to why, but it's not really important. I just wish there were more bees around. Although I know that that's kind of going to be a heartbreaking process because, colony failure is definitely a thing. Anyway. Well, it's what stirs on your passions, what stirs on your sense of wonder, and what do you know about it? If I decided to go start doing beekeeping without having done the prerequisite knowledge for it, I'm going to fall flat on my face, and I may figure it out using an amateurish process, much like the same for making mead, for example. Knowledge on the matter is not going to hurt. In fact, it will better modulate the experiential aspect of it. If I just decided to go out to my local river and start diving deep without any equipment on, am I going to learn something about diving? The answer is yes. Is it going to be fatal? The answer is well. Am I going to be better off if I learn more about the process? Witchcraft is identical. Witchcraft is exactly that. You owe it to yourself, and you owe it to the entities you're evoking, and if you're not evoking entities, are you doing witchcraft? That kind of comes into a question for me, and that's kind of why I have a little bit of pause now. I do want this to work for... I do think that this can work for, and this is kind of, at this point, this is like a 5-year mental exercise, atheist witchcraft. How does that work, and how can that work? I'm kind of coming to the hard conclusion that if you have a naturalist a materialist worldview that doesn't have room for spirits, that doesn't have room for entities, then you can't do witchcraft. Witchcraft invariably involves these entities. And why do I say that? Well, let's say that you are someone who has... Ultimately, this comes down to correspondences, and you can reject the correspondences of the ancients. That's fine, and we have correspondences that kind of get charted through time. They change, they shift. And what do I mean when I say correspondences? Well, perhaps the best route for that would be talking about stones. And people call them crystals. They're not crystals. Crystals are... There are some stones, that we will have as crystals, but there are people who would call things that are blatantly not crystalline in their structure crystals, just because they're pretty rocks. And this kind of, this is a big deal breaker for me on kind of the sort of the pop Wicca, is talking about crystals and rocks and stones. When I think of crystals or rocks or stones, I go in a few directions with it. The first one is I start to think about their affiliations and their connections. I think about things like the elements. I think about things like it turns into it's analogous to talking about the magical uses of herbs. For me, having some knowledge in herbalism, my wife is very, very more knowledgeable on that subject than I am. Herbs have medicinal properties and medicinal uses. If the magical use of that herb is utterly unrelated or alien to the medicinal use of that herb, then the magical use of that herb is ignoring the the properties of the herb. If you're using lavender, for example, and you're trying to make it so that it excites you, it agitates you, it gets you going. You have an elemental association of fire to lavender. That's ignorant. That doesn't understand lavender is a calming and soothing thing. It has antiviral properties. It has there's a lot of different bits and pieces of lavender, and that's why we see it in bath bombs. We see it in a relaxation setting. We see it. I make tincture of lavender partially for that purpose, but also as I believe it's an antiviral, and I've said that again now. I need to double check, but I can double check because I have a book of. It's so actually this kind of gets into a little bit of the magical journaling thing. I've written down a number of the various medicinal uses of herbs, and of course in the process I've written down some magical uses of them, which are in relation to the medicinal uses of those herbs. For example, to make this a little bit more personal, I'm very, very interested in working with spirits, so for example, you see a lot of people that are having issues with spirits in the house. They're having an issue with, we'll call it a haunting, for example, or they moved into a new place and it seems occupied, ahem. Well, if you wanted to create a calm, relaxing, if you wanted to relax things, if you wanted to take the temperature down a little bit, I think I said in some previous podcast of some sort to someone, or maybe I was just relating this. Well, anyway, something that I do if there are spirits or entities in the house, like when we moved in here, we had a lot of nightmares. There were a lot of nightmares. The children were affected. It was problematic. Well, ultimately, I always prefer to take your enemy and make it your friend. I would much prefer that if there is an entity in this house, I want to make peace. And that can be on their terms. I don't mind. I'm the new guy, so let me make peace with you. So what do I do? What does that involve? Well, you burn nice smelling herbs. You burn nice smelling incense. You brew some nice tea that you would have for yourself, and you pour them a cup, and you pour yourself a cup. And you sit there with the tea for a little while. And you just try and open up your awareness, or acknowledge that you may not necessarily feel anything, and you may feel that it's an empty gesture, and you may feel like a jackass. And trust me, all of that very much has a place in magic. Well, so in a similar sort of sense, like by burning lavender and getting that sort of essence into the air, spirits have a very... It's a weird thing to say, but spirits have, and you find this all throughout, the Renaissance grimoire tradition. You find it going back and back and back and back. Why do we burn incense? Well, because spirits and entities apparently are affected by that. they, in my own mind, they have a good sense of smell. And so if you want to attract things, if you want things to be more pleasant, well, what do you find attractive? What do you find pleasant? If you want to repel something or get something to go the hell away, well, I'm not advising you to, get some boiled eggs or something and some unpleasant smells. I'm not trying to tell you to somehow, get some sulfur to burn, in which you're gonna, literally it's gonna turn into sulfuric acid in your lungs. That's bad. But by the same token, like things that you may buy but don't like the smell of, if you wanted to use that, go ahead. It's strange, and I said this in a conversation with a friend of mine. On the subject of kind of cultural appropriation in terms of like, well, what has smudging become to the witch community? What is smudging? And, smudge sticks and saging. I'm going to sage the house. They'll use the item, they'll use the very specific term, they'll use the proper noun, they'll use the noun describing it exactly, the name of the herb, for a practice that doesn't necessarily need to involve the herb. You don't need to sage with sage. You don't need to sage with Palo Santo. You don't need to, waft a holy smoke or waft a spiritual smoke. You don't need to do that with any particular herb. It's about what's available to you. It's about using what you've got. If you wanted to try out something that you had growing in your yard, if you have some rosemary growing, or even to the point of like trying out onion grass, like use what you have available. If you live in a city, if you live in an herbal environment, you may have to make use of, your local, you may have to make use of, well, heck, you could go to the grocery store. You could go to your grocery store and buy they have a variety of herbs there. Rosemary, sage, for example. Are these going to be the best examples? Are these going to be pre-prepared smudge sticks? No, but who said you needed those anyway? That's this weird, I don't understand. I'm not saying don't support your local witchy shop. Go ahead and support them or whatever. But if you feel like, saging is going to be infringing on someone else's religious practices and you don't want to do it, or you want to avoid the controversy. I mean, honestly, if you're walking around and someone waves at you and you do a gesture and, someone next to you says, what was that? And you're like, what? I just kind of waved him off. I said, okay, fine. It's like, you're dismissing him. That's disrespectful. Well, I mean, certainly you can keep doing what you're doing. You can keep, doing like this sort of gesture instead of, I'm not suggesting anything here. Like, in traffic, when someone waves you on, there are different kind of like ways in which you could wave someone on, and some of them are more readily accessible or readily understood than others. Other ones, it may seem like it's a dismissing gesture, and that may seem like it's a little bit rude. If you're being rude to someone and someone points it out, you don't want to be rude, so you don't do it. That's kind of, to a point, how I see a good bit of cultural appropriation, at least on the subject of, say, using sage. Your local witchy shop will be glad to sell you other herbs if they have other herbs. They don't need to sell you sage. They don't need to sell you Palo Santo or anything like that. But yeah, if you're not going to offend anybody when you use sweetgrass as opposed to those other items, then you can use the sweetgrass. And ultimately, like, this is where the knowledge part comes in. This is where your own experiences also come in. But if somebody tells you from an authoritative viewpoint a certain thing, if you know about the topic, you can kind of call that out and say, well, wait a minute, is that actually what you just said? Is that true? It's not so much a question of like, where did you get it? Like you're wielding knowledge or like, using it against people. But by the same token, there's a lot of ignorance out there. And the word for it is definitely ignorance. Your own personal experiences are not necessarily ignorance, but they're personal experiences. So why are you sharing them as if they're authoritative to other people? Because they're not. If I have a personal relationship with a particular deity, I can tell you about my relationship, but it's not like I'm going to tell you about your relationship with that deity. And I think that a lot of people kind of utilize the UPG of others, or others press their UPG onto other people in a way that's not useful. Like, for example, if there's someone who honestly and earnestly swears by saging, for example, and they say, no, it must be sage, it has to be sage, sage is the prescribed item, it has to be that. Well, in this case, if I suggest that it may not have to be that, and I'm doing so based on my own experiences or based on my own knowledges. There's no reason not to try it out and see if it works for you. And if it doesn't work, discard it. And if it does work, well, that's fine. But, don't take my word for it. Never take anyone's word for it. Always, be out there learning and growing in your own way. All right. So, you've gotten to the end of this podcast, because I like to keep these short. I like to keep them to 30 minutes or less. Before I forget to say this, before I do my final little conclusion here, I'm going to say that, yeah, you can reach me. You can reach Sassafras at, and I love hearing about your experiences. I was tempted to do one on what people have sent me. I'm not quite sure exactly how I'm going to phrase it, because a lot of folks have really kind of tragic. I like hearing people's life stories. I like hearing about people's paths. And that it may well be kind of turning into kind of like a solo project or just a thing that I'm thinking about, because a lot of people have a lot of experiences that are really interesting and tragic. And I myself didn't have a tragic kind of path leading here. I mean, I guess I did in my own way, but not to the extent of some of the folks in the way that they were kind of like brought up and indoctrinated in the religions of their society. So if you want to share your path with me, I would love to read it. I have no issues whatsoever with that. I take great pleasure in that, because it's always food for thought, and I like hearing about perspectives that aren't my own, even critical ones, because it's an opportunity for me to learn something. Anyway, I can be reached at heartofwitchcraft@gmail.com. I can be reached on Twitter at heartwitchcraft. And like my conclusion here is that knowledge, in a lot of ways, the easiest kind of way of getting knowledge is correspondences. I like correspondences, and I think correspondences are useful. I think there's a great depth hidden behind all of those charts. I don't think you should take them at like first glance, but you'll find in the back of, say, I think that they're a good starting point, a good starting place, but I also think you need to think critically on them. So, for example, a lot of folks read Cunningham's what is it? Wicca, A Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. I want to say that's the title. In the back of that, it has all kinds of correspondences, connections, that sort of thing. It's great and useful. I would definitely say to think about them, and it would only be of benefit for you to learn about them and write about them and do some thinking on them before you kind of just take it that way. But there's no reason not to play with what you see and that sort of thing. Learning is definitely what this is about, and knowledge is definitely useful in the course of learning, but they're not exactly the same thing. But anyway, I think I've blathered at you long enough, and I've rambled on from topic to topic in a sufficient capacity for one Sunday. So I hope that this finds you well. I hope that you're doing well, and this is Sassafras, and blessed be.